Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to focus on the beginning of our unit on the Civil War. And so I thought it would be a good idea just to kind of start with some big ideas. So I would pause the video here for as long as it takes for you guys to copy down these different points. We're going to be doing a discussion, kind of a debate discussion on Wednesday regarding these different theories as to why the Civil War took place. So I want you guys to try and keep them in mind. There's lots of different reasons for why the Civil War is fought. So I want you to keep these things in mind as we go through them. I think in the past you've probably been given a simplified version of why the Civil War is fought, and it's centered around slavery, but they never go into what aspects of slavery. Is it fought for slavery as a political institution, slavery as an economic institution, as a social institution? What are the economic differences between the North and the South? And also kind of this whole argument of states' rights that keeps kind of coming up within our class, which is a trend throughout the early 1800s. So I want you to pause the video right now and just copy these four theories down. All right, so what we're focusing on for today's lesson is going to be the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1850, it really fuels this sectional tension. And what you're going to notice is that basically from the Mexican Cession on, up until the election of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln gets elected, there are several events that take place that really drive sectional tension, that pull the North and South apart. And that's what I think I want you guys to picture in your mind, kind of the pulling apart of the country, because they're drifting apart. They've been drifting apart at this point for years, but what's going to happen is that in this last decade, they're just going to kind of be ripped apart at the seams. And so it really all kind of starts and can be traced back to the westward expansion of the country. So one thing I think students forget, which is an important thing to understand, is that each new territory that we acquire, every time we acquire a new territory, it brings up again the issue of slavery. It's not like they solve it in the first time we acquire territory and then the issue is done and they have a rule that kind of governs every new territory that we gain. It's not the case. Every new territory we gain, from the first one, the Northwest and Southwest Territory, to the Louisiana Purchase, to Texas, to the Mexican Cession, they have to reopen that wound of slavery and decide on new rules for governing the territory. So I just want to kind of briefly review with you guys so that you understand. Like I said, each territory has its own unique rules. So for example, this first territory that we gained this territory after the American Revolution as a result from the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The territory is from east of the Mississippi River to west of the Appalachian Mountains. So it's known as the Northwest Territory and the Southwest Territory. And so the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 really dictates how slavery is dealt with in the territory, and the Southwest Ordinance of 1790 dictates how it's dealt with in the Southwest Territory. So the Northwest Territory is really the northern part of the territory, and basically it just bans slavery completely. Now, Thomas Jefferson originally wanted to ban slavery entirely in the entire new territory gained, but that kind of gets a lot of pushback from Southerners, and so really the Southwest Territory is then opened up to slavery, and that includes states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. All right. The next big piece of land that we gain is going to be the Louisiana Purchase, right there in the middle of the screen. And so the Louisiana Purchase was bought by Thomas Jefferson from Napoleon, and we discussed it in two aspects. We discussed why Napoleon was selling it, why Jefferson wanted to buy it, and we also discussed when the first time slavery kind of came up. They left that on, again, the back burner for a while. They buy it in 1803, but they don't really bring up the issue of slavery until Missouri wants to come in as a slave state. And so the rule that governs the Louisiana Purchase is a unique rule. So they use a line of latitude, 36 degrees 30 north latitude, and they pretty much just draw it straight across the Louisiana Territory. Anything south of the line is a slave state, anything north of the line is a free state. The last piece of land, well, Texas, we talked about annexation, and Texas already had slavery at that point. But the last piece of land, which they gained through the Mexican Cession at the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, this is undecided at this point. So they have to figure out, what are we going to do with the Mexican cession? Are we going to do the same thing in Louisiana? Are we going to pick a line and draw it across? There's all these different ideas floating out there. And so in Congress before this, they had been practicing the gag rule, if you remember, trying not to discuss slavery because they know how divisive the issue is. But in this case, they can't ignore it. And so senators start proposing ideas. So the first guy who comes out with an idea, even actually before we gained the territory in 1846, a senator named David Wilmot is going to promote or present something known as the Wilmot Proviso. And this he's a northerner, and what this does is it proposes to ban slavery entirely in the Mexican cession. Now, when you think of the Wilmot Proviso, I want you to think back to the Talmadge Amendment before the Missouri Compromise, because James Talmadge of New York said a very similar thing about the Louisiana Purchase. And what's going to happen to the Wilmot Proviso is it's going to meet the same resistance as the Talmadge Amendment. And so Southerners are going to be dead set against it, keep voting it down. Northerners are going to keep trying to propose it and trying to get the Wilmot Proviso passed. Now, I think an important thing to think about is Wilmot knew about the Talmadge Amendment. He knew Southerners' opinions. He knew Southerners were going to try and block this idea from happening, and yet he still proposed it. And I believe the reason he proposed it was to bring the issue to the forefront, to make it known that Northerners want free soil in these new territories. That they're not what the Whigs were accusing the Democrats of doing, of fighting the war to extend slavery. They wanted it to be a free soil territory, and that becomes an important rallying cry of Northerners, of a little bit of the Whig Party, and then there's going to be some new parties, well, for example, the Republican Party, which is the third party at the time, is going to start to espouse this idea of free soil, and they eventually become a main party. So the Wilmot Proviso is presented but rejected, but an important thing nonetheless. Now, both Northerners and Southerners are appealing to the idea of, or the ideals of, freedom and equality in order to defend their position. The Northern perspective, it may not be what you think. The Northern perspective is saying, if you allow slavery, you're infringing upon white Americans' freedom and equality, meaning a Northerner cannot compete with slave labor, and so if you bring slavery in there, slavery is going to dominate. So it impedes upon a free white person having their true rights as Americans. Southerners are going to say the same thing, that it impedes upon their freedom and equality, but from a different perspective. Southerners are going to say, if you ban slavery, owning a slave is a property right that I have as an American, and you're taking away my rights of property and their chance at in their view of the American dream. So one of the ironic things about this argument is that both Northerners and Southerners are appealing to the same constitutional principles, the same ideologies to defend their positions. They're coming to widely different conclusions about slavery and about what should happen in the Union, but they're using the same American ideals, the same American principles to voice their opinions and voice their perspective within the country. Now, since the Wilmot Proviso fails, people are going to kind of come onto the scene to try and save the Union and save the country and come up with a compromise. So you're looking at Henry Clay, and you may remember Henry Clay from earlier times in our class, and he was obviously a lot younger back then. I mean, at this point, he's old, and he's been in Congress for a long time, and he doesn't have much longer to kind of influence the government. And all of those great statesmen that came to Congress in the congressional period of 1808 to 1812, they're really kind of all on their way out, and they've been trying to shape America for a long time. Somebody like Henry Clay, he's an ardent patriot, nationalist. He came up with the American system. He's very much against sectionalism, trying to unify the country. Proposes all these ideas, even though he's a Southerner, he proposes ideas that he thinks are going to be good for the country. And so, although we may look back at somebody like Henry Clay and criticize him for caving in and compromising on slavery with the Missouri Compromise, again, here with the Compromise of 1850, I really do believe he had good intentions, that he's trying to save what he feels is his country, and he doesn't want it to disintegrate into a civil war, because the rhetoric out there at the time, they're very much concerned about a civil war breaking out, and they know that this could be the issue that sparks it. So he comes up, he proposes a compromise. So there's really three big components to his compromise that you need to understand. The first part is he's going to say we should allow California, right here, to come into the Union as a free state. California wanted, this is what really sparks the issue, because California, as soon as we get the Mexican cession, very soon after, gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, and there's a gold rush out to California, and people are start moving out there in huge population. So their population just kind of like spring loads to a huge amount, and they ask to be a state, and they want to come into the Union as a free state. Now, people are nervous because this throws off the balance of power between the North and the South again, just like when Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state back in the 1820s. So they're nervous about this situation, and they won't need to come up with some conclusion about how to deal with it. So Clay thinks he comes up with a good idea. Basically, they're going to allow California to come in as a free state. That's the first part of the Compromise of 1850. The second part is with the rest of the territory here. Okay, the rest of the Mexican cession, they're going to allow them to practice something known as popular sovereignty. So that's an important term. Popular sovereignty is allowing the people of the territory to vote on whether or not they want to be a free state or a slave state once they do enter the Union. So it's different from Congress making a law, right? The Missouri Compromise, that's congressional laws that they made determining slave and free states. This is going to be popular sovereignty. So it's an implementation of what would be known as direct democracy. And Americans at this time, remember, it's a democratic impulse within America. This is a carryover from Jacksonian democracy. And there's a lot of people in America who believe this is the best form of democracy. If you go directly to the people and you ask the people, what do you want? And whatever they decide, they feel like it's democratic. Okay, and that brings up a big question. Is it truly democratic? If you go straight to the people, what if they decide something totally immoral, something totally wrong? Just because the majority wants it, should it happen? Okay, but there's groups of Americans at the time who believe, yes, of course, if the majority of Americans want it, then it should happen, no matter what it is, including something like slavery. So the rest of the Mexican cession, popular sovereignty. The third big component of it is they pass a fugitive slave law. And the fugitive slave law pretty much gives Southerners the right to go into Northern territory and retrieve runaway slaves. Now, they kind of always had a fugitive slave law on the books, but what this does is it strengthens it, and it really adds the fact that Southerners and Northerners' eyes, they view Southerners as being allowed to now invade their territory to go back and take slaves back into slavery. So what I think is interesting about the compromise is that pretty much neither side is really happy about it. The North does not like the fugitive slave law, and we're going to talk about that on Monday. The South feels like they gained nothing from it, that they already had a fugitive slave law. California's coming in as a free state. The rest of these territories, as we talked about in class, geographically, they don't see much potential for them to be slave states, and so they kind of feel like they haven't gotten much out of the compromise either. Now, the compromise itself is very difficult to get past. So I just want to introduce you guys to another famous congressman who comes on the scene, Stephen Douglas. He's known as the Little Giant, is one of his nicknames due to his small stature. But what he does in this compromise is he breaks the compromise up into components. And by voting component by component, they're able to get the Compromise of 1850 passed. So we're going to talk about him much more. He comes up a lot in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which happens in 1854. Now, what I think is important just before the screencast ends is two, again, elder statesmen in America and influential congressmen, John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster, play a role in the Compromise of 1850. Calhoun, the ever-present Southerner, and remember, leader of nullification crisis, gives a rousing speech against the compromise. Webster, on the other hand, tries to promote it, even though he's against it, because just like Clay, he feels like you have to put the Union first above your section. Calhoun is epitomizing putting your section above the country. Now, before you guys go, I think this is a good assignment since you didn't have class to look at. It's Calhoun's speech, so give it a look and try and answer